Hey guys, it's Nathan from the Kentucky Cycling YouTube channel. Welcome to our second Zoom interview in the Kentucky Cycling Connection series. I'm very excited to introduce my guest, Barry Gary from the Louisville Cycling Podcast. Welcome, Barry.
Hey, Nathan, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
We're very glad to have you. I thought we'd launch in just with some personal background questions, just kind of get to know you stuff, if that's okay. So why don't we start by having you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
A little about me. I've always been kind of a lifelong learner. I was in the learning and development field for, over 25 years, and recently transitioned over for the last 3 or 4 years. I've been helping friends and family with mortgages. And so I recently transitioned full-time to what was originally going to be part of a retirement plan is now my full-time job as a mortgage professional. So I help people with getting new houses and refinancing and things like that. I've been a lifelong cyclist with only one little blip on the screen. And that's about it. Besides riding my bike, working, and I do like to ride my motorcycle. It keeps me pretty busy.
All right. Well, cool. So how did you actually get into cycling?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I actually got a bicycle because way back when I started in college, I met a girl who was really cute and she rode a bicycle. And I thought, I need a bicycle, and found out that, not only was she probably, cuter and outside of my range, she was also faster than I was. So that didn't work out either. And so I kept the bicycle, didn't get the girl, but it worked out pretty good.
I see you've got a cool looking setup there. So tell us a little about your the setup that we're seeing around you. Is this the home base for the Louisville Cycling Podcast?
It is. I do the Louisville Cycling Podcast out of this room. I have a little studio in my house that's treated for sound. And I'm a little bit. I think if you're a cyclist, you're also kind of a gearhead automatically because there's so much equipment and stuff you can look at. I'm kind of the same way with my podcast. I do 3 different podcasts. I do the Louisville Cycling Podcast. I do just started a new one called I Love Kentucky, which is something I'm just launching. And also I worked at Norton Healthcare for 8 or 9 years. And I still do a podcast for physicians called MedChat. And so I do podcasting is something I'm really kind of passionate about, mostly because it's got so much cool stuff you can always learn about. And so what you see around me is kind of the studio I've built in my house to make it a little easy to produce those podcasts.
So, of course, we'll get into more about the podcast in a bit, but I want to dig in more into this whole cycling background of yours. So I gather from listening to your podcast that you're a roadie. Is that a correct description?
Primarily, I ride road bikes. I ride everything. I mean, I've raced mountain bikes. I've raced track bikes. I've raced cyclocross. Very little cyclocross is hard on you. But primarily, I ride a road bike. I still have a garage of far too many bikes, that I keep because I like to do different things. But most of my time on a bike has been spent on a road bike. Yeah.
Tell me. So you mentioned the word race, and that's a word that I know you and I have talked previously. But I'm not a racer myself, and so I want to get into the racing mentality a little. So when did you first go from being a rider to being a racer?
I think the first races I started dabbling in was when I was still in college in Bowling Green, and there was I guess it was probably part of a spring training race series, and I decided, well, I've been riding my bike and racers look cool, and a lot of people that I wanted to ride with were racers and kind of fast. And I thought, well, I'm gonna get my, back then it was I think they only had a Cat 4 was the low end. I get my Cat 4 license. I'm gonna go do a race. And so I showed up at this race, and it was kind of a chilly morning. I looked around, and people it looked like they had things coming out from underneath their shorts to cover their legs. I had a pair of tights I was going to pull on. I thought, I guess you wear those inside. So I go run in my car, take off my shorts, put my tights underneath, and then put my cycling shorts over top of it. And not only did I get immediately dropped in that race, but I also ended up chafing myself pretty bad because I had tights with no chamois, underneath my shorts. And so I literally started from ground zero. And when I graduated college and moved here to Louisville, I fell in with a group of guys who had been racing for a long time, and just by luck, started riding with them and started doing races and and struggled for the first year or two. I found out real quickly that you really have to stick with it if you want to race, because it takes 2, 3, 4 years before you finally get some legs under you where you feel like I belong here. It's just a struggle up to then. And I don't know that I'm naturally talented for cyclists by any means, but I'm fairly persistent and kept with it, and ended up from there really enjoying that kind of the competition side of it and just the training with folks and being around people you enjoy being with.
Well, so would you say that your gravitation towards becoming a racer was a product of who you were hanging out with, or was there some evidence of a competitive streak in your background prior to that?
I've always had a pretty strong competitive streak, and it's kind of funny. I'm more competitive with myself than I am others, and so occasionally I find things that I'm intrigued by, and I want to be good at it,
Mm-hmm.
and so that becomes a personal challenge. And so when I went to that first race and found out that wow, this is a whole different kind of riding than what I've been doing. I got to do something different. It kind of got in my mind that, well, I want to be able to do this. And when I came to Louisville, and again, when I came here, the people I fell into were probably certainly the best riders and racers in this region. And in some respects, kind of some of the top level people across the country at the time too. And they were really good cyclists. And so it was difficult, but it wasn't, so difficult that I didn't think it was achievable to be able to ride with those guys. And I was able to kind of persist and I've raced for a long, long time. And as long as there wasn't a long sustained climb, I was good. Never was a climber, still not a climber, but that's, you just kind of find what you're good at and try to race around that.
So what type of races are you most comfortable doing, either back when you started or now?
Well, I don't race a lot now. I've dabbled in thinking about it, and I've been in a couple little races and things like that. But now I still feel like I should be able to ride with and keep up with the racer people. So I still kind of trained to do that. I did a couple races last year early on just for the fun of it. But it's been a long time since I've been an active racer. But when I raced, to say I'm most comfortable with it, it may not be true. But the thing that could be best at was things like criteriums and track race, things that had to do with a lot of leg speed. And I tend to have more fast twitch muscles than slow twitch. And so I always had a fairly good jump and could keep up when the speed got high. And so I like criteriums, and I was always a good bike handler. And so being able to do that kind of fast, close, lots of turns sort of thing, fit into my strengths more than a long 70-mile road race with 2-3 mile climbs in the middle of it. That to me, that was just a miserable kind of death slog.
So crit races can be varying lengths, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're usually by time. I mean, anywhere from, depending on the category and everything, anything from 30 minutes to 90 minutes typically. Okay. Usually on a course that's around a mile or a little more long, usually in a kind of an urban area where we've got lots of corners and turns and things like that. So they're typically very fast, very short, and very intense. I mean, to be good at a crit, you got to be good at recovering quickly, because there's a whole lot of jump chase, and so it's never that first or second big intense effort that gets people. It's the sixth or seventh one, and so you have to be able to go hard, recover several times to do well in the criterium.
I've only ever been out and watched a crit race one time. It was here in downtown Frankfurt. And there was a guy, he actually had a carbon bike, but he had taken a fall, and he had a tear in his jersey on his shoulder. And then he had his fork was literally like broken in half. And I was talking to somebody who was racing later in the day, I guess was a master's level guy, and I was talking to him like how expensive is this? He said, well, that guy just had a really expensive day. so that made me think about falls. I mean, so have you, when you were ever doing crit racing, did you ever take a fall in a race?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you're going to race, you're going to fall at some point, and it could be because you go into a corner a little hot, or somebody in front of you goes into a corner a little hot, and you slide out or something. But the good thing about criteriums, they're fast, and the falls typically don't really hurt you a lot, because you hit and kind of slide forward on the pace. It's not like you're falling from a 6-foot ladder and just plop down on the ground. Mm-hmm. Your momentum's going forward. And so a lot of times you end up with road rash, and it looks kind of nasty, because you end up kind of taking a lot of skin off and everything, but it doesn't really hurt you a lot, and rarely does it really mess your bike up too much, because most of the momentum is going forward, not straight down. So yeah, you fall. It's one of those things where you get up and you run to the pit and get your free lap, and your adrenaline's all going. You chase back on, and a lot of times you end up doing better after a crash, because now you've got all this adrenaline going through your body. It's part of it. You don't want to crash, I mean, certainly, but you do.
What was sort of the time frame when you actually came back? I guess you went to Western. When you graduated from Western, came back to Louisville, were racing. I mean, what period of time was this that you were sort of in your racing heyday?
Yeah, I would say mostly early 90s, 1990s was most of it, and into the early 2000s. My son was born in 1995. And when he got into middle school, he started playing football, and I started supporting him playing football, and I coached him through football until he graduated high school in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
And he played low college ball, and he went to college to play. And so it was that period between his middle school years. So I guess that was probably between 2005 and 2014. I think there was a period when I didn't even have a bike, because I was, then after he went to school, I sat around and noticed how fat I was getting, and thought, I really should get another bicycle. So at the end of around 2014, I started riding again pretty steadily, and starting to feel, halfway fit on certain days now again.
So how big a gap was there when you were off the bike?
It was a big gap. I mean, there was a few months where I felt almost brand new again, because I literally was not riding a bike at all for 5 or 6 years. So there was a time when I started riding it, I was like, oh, this is hard. But you just keep at it, and it's easier to get it back than it is to get it the first time.
Sure.
So you just keep riding and keep out there, and you ride with people who are a little bit better than you. So it kind of makes you angry when you're not keeping up, and you work harder, and before you know it, you're back at it.
Where's your favorite place to ride there in Louisville?
There's a couple of routes. My big thing is one of the things I don't like is I don't like driving my car to go ride my bike. And so most of the routes that I ride, I like to just jump on my bike in the garage and go and meet folks. And so I end up riding a lot these days. I live over in eastern Jefferson County, and I end up popping down Wolf Pen Branch, down River Road, and across over into Indiana, because there's so many. The new bridge, East End Bridge, has opened up so much good riding over in southern Indiana, where you can go over and you can go anywhere from 40 to 100 miles and maybe see 15 cars. So most of the time I'm riding over in southern Indiana these days on my road bike. But then last weekend we pulled the mountain bikes out and went to Turkey Run Park and rode mountain bikes. That's always a fun diversion. If the weather gets a little nasty, we'll pull our cross bikes out and we'll get out and ride on those. And I try to keep enough variety in it that it doesn't just seem like the same old thing all the time. But most of the time, I'd say 75-80% of the time, I'm out on my road bike.
So you mentioned a road bike and a mountain bike. So tell me about your bike stable. How many bikes you have, and what are they?
Right now, I'm down to 4 full bikes. I've got a road bike, and I ride a giant TCR, Dura-Ace TI2 road bike. I've got a Ridley cross bike, and I have a giant XDR mountain bike. I still ride a hardtail. I haven't gotten. I guess I'm just stubborn enough to keep riding a hardtail. I don't have dual suspension, and keep wondering if I want to or not. That's a topic for another day. and then I have a second cross bike that it's an aluminum frame that I use just as a kind of tool around bike, but also use that on my my Wahoo trainer during the winter. Again, I probably don't need to, but I just kind of hesitate putting carbon frames on a stationary trainer.
Turning our attention to the Louisville Cycling Podcast, I'd like to break this down a bit. So how did you get into podcasting, and what drew you to this medium in particular?
Well, I first started thinking about podcasting from my career in learning and development. One of the challenges when you work in a learning and development field is, one of the things I know is that the closer that learning occurs to the work you do, the more effective it is. And to do work one day and to go to a class one day and then leave the class and try to apply it to work, that's typically not very effective as a learning methodology, even though it's the easiest thing to do and it's what everybody does all the time. And so I was trying to think about, how do you get content to people in ways that they consume when and where they are. And I've always listened to podcasts. I think I've been a podcast listener from the first time, iTunes started launching podcasts. And my list of podcasts on my phone is far too long for me to ever think I'm going to listen to all of it. And so I started thinking about podcasting as a learning medium. I thought, man, this would be a great tool to deliver content to people in ways that you could listen to while you're commuting to work, while you're working in the yard, while you're doing all kinds of stuff. You could be learning at the same time. It grew as an interest from that perspective. And so again, I went out and bought some simple equipment, tried to read a lot on the internet and try to do it all myself. And I thought, well, it's good, but it really didn't sound like what I was hearing. And so I met a gentleman who used to be in the music industry in New York, and he started getting into podcasting, and he's an audio engineer, and he has a podcast engineering school. And so I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it right. So I went to the podcast engineering school and learned how to do it, which ended up costing me probably more money than most of the bikes I have, because once you learn about all this stuff, it's unending what you can do to try to make your sound, minusculely better. All this happened around that same time when I was just starting to ride again. Mm-hmm. And I also was thinking, well, I really, in 5 or 6 years, a lot of the people in the cycling community had changed. Some of the people riding and racing now were, my teammates' kids. And I wanted to learn more about how the community had changed and some of the things that are going on. I thought, well, heck, I can just, if I had a podcast, I could get people to come in and we could talk and I could find a way to reconnect with the cycling community off the bike as well as on the bike. And it really turned out to be pretty good, because I'd go out for a ride and people go, I'd introduce myself to somebody and I'd say, hey, I'm Barry. I think, oh, you're that podcast guy. And I'm like, yeah. And so it kind of helped me kind of get back into the community again in a way that was different than just on the bike. It's been good. I'm approaching 50 episodes of the podcast. I'm not as good at publishing every week like I should. So usually I publish an episode every 2 to 3 weeks. So that, 50 episodes is about, almost 2 years of doing that podcast. And it's going pretty well. Continues to grow. I continue to get listeners.
Cool. So talk to me about metrics. How do you know how many listeners you have with podcasting?
Well, I think with podcasting, it's a really hard question to answer. You can't even find out how many subscribers you have, and the metrics behind podcasting aren't all that great. And so what I do know is how many unique downloads I have of an episode.
Okay.
My listenership ranges. The Louisville Cycling Podcast is kind of a niche podcast. It's about cycling in and around Louisville, Kentucky. But I still average anywhere from 300 to 600 downloads an episode. It's not huge, but for a small niche, podcast about cycling in one city, it does what I want it to do. Who knows how many subscribers? Who knows how many, actual, listen to each and every episode? But it's, podcast metrics are not great. But for me, it's not so much about how many people listen to an episode. Mm-hmm. It's more about the engagement that it gives to me with those audience. Because really the other, kind of sideline goal of my podcast is that, I also mentioned it in there that I'm in the mortgage business. And so this podcast and the other one I do about I Love Kentucky, part of the strategy is I want to find something that is interesting enough to build an audience around something like cycling in Louisville. Mm-hmm. And then while you're there, and I always throw in a little 10, 15-second ad that reminds people that I do mortgages. If you're a cyclist in Louisville and it comes time to refinance your house, or you're getting ready to buy a new house and you got to get a mortgage, you go, oh, wait a minute, I'll call Barry. For me, it's a little bit of a business marketing tool as well as as kind of an entertainment tool. It's not so much about how many people listen, but it's how many people are listening that might buy a house soon.
Well, it's nice that you can tie your passion, for cycling and to your career. That's cool. What were your goals for the podcast when you first started it, and how has it changed over time?
Well, when I first started it, my goal was to get 100 people to listen to it. And I thought, here, because I go on these group rides and stuff, and we, on a really nice sunny day with a lot of people, we may have 30, 40 people that are in a group on occasion. And I thought, well, there's 30 or 40. And if I could just somehow get another 30 or 40 to listen, if I can get 100 downloads, that's pretty successful. And if you look at, podcast stats across the board, if you have 145 listens per episode, you're better than half of the podcast in Apple Podcast.
That's an interesting metric.
And Apple Podcast just surpassed 1 million podcasts this past week.
Wow.
So if you look at, if you've got 145 listens per episode, you're better than over 500,000 other podcasts. So I thought, well, that's a pretty good. And when I started the podcast, 114 was the number. If I'm better than 50%, I'm doing okay. And it's, and so it's one of those things where there's so many podcasts and so many little niche podcasts. And when I talk about podcasts, it's not so much like radio or movies or something like that. The best analogy to a podcast that I have, it's more like magazines. So when you go to like Barnes and Noble and see all those different magazines on the shelf, there's like Hummingbird Weekly.
Mm-hmm.
Who's buying Hummingbird Weekly? Well, there's probably enough people to make that magazine viable.
Mm-hmm.
And so podcasting is really about finding the niche you want to talk about. And because there's somebody out there that will listen to it. And so it's much more like a magazine than it is a radio show.
That's cool. So what are some things that you've actually learned about Louisville cycling through doing this podcast that you didn't know before?
Most interesting things that I've learned were personal stories about people I've known for years that I didn't know. Because when you're out on the bike and you're riding, you talk and you chat and things like that, but you really don't, you don't go very deep. And in the podcast, I bring people in that I've ridden with for years, and we're talking, and I ask questions and listen to stories. And at the end of the episode, I'm like, wow, I never knew that.
Mm-hmm.
And these are people I've known for, 20, 25 years. And I never knew that little interesting tidbit, never knew they did that, or never knew they had that job in their career or something like that. And so for me, some of the best things were some of the personal insights about people that came out. Now, about the cycling community as a whole, I think it wasn't really surprising, but one of the things that really kind of gelled for me was realizing how strong the cycling community in Louisville is now. There's been a lot of really exciting things. I mean, Louisville, Kentucky is the only place outside of Europe that's ever held the cyclocross worlds. We had, in 2013, they had all the world championships of cyclocross was right here in Louisville, Kentucky, which is unheard of. We've got, people who have multiple world championships that ride in Louisville, people with multiple national championships. We have a junior community that's so strong, and so many juniors who are coming up and being looked at by pro teams, or probably will be looked at by pro teams. It's just, there's a very strong community of cyclists, especially on that racing side here in Louisville. I don't know as much about, the touring side or the triathlon side. The mountain bike side, I know just enough because I, ride a mountain bike, but I really don't know about, a lot of it. And so for me, the other piece is learning more about those other disciplines that I haven't been quite as deep in myself.
So I'm interested to know, what are a couple of your favorite episodes that you've done and why?
Well, there's several episodes that I like, but a couple that I'll point out for different reasons. One, I did an interview with the Mayor Greg Fisher here in Louisville about how cycling fits into his vision for Louisville as a healthier city, and he has kind of a 3-pillar vision for the city of Louisville, and one of those pillars has to do with greater health. And so we had a conversation around how cycling fits into his vision, because he's a huge supporter of the cycling community and cycling. He does a ride with the mayor, several times a year, where people come out on their bikes and go for a ride with the mayor and talk about issues and things like that. He's a cyclist. He loves to ride his bike, and he loves to see it happening around the city. And he's gotten some flack over some of his. He likes bike lanes, and he likes doing things to help cyclists. And Louisville maybe is not always as cycling friendly as we'd like for it to be, in terms of just general population, but he's a strong supporter. So that's a real good episode. And then the other one, and it's actually also my most downloaded episode. And you don't know if there's a gentleman here in town. His name is Bob Rowe, and he's raced forever. He and I, we were on the same race team way back when. His son's a strong racer right now, but he's been real key, one of those kind of pieces of glue in the cycling community. I mean, for the past few years, he's been the major organizer of the training rides and things like that. And we sat down and talked, and ended up talking for like 2 hours. I had to break it into 2 episodes because we started talking about his background. Just a fascinating person with a really interesting background. And the second part of that interview, part 2 of his interview, is more about his story and less about cycling technically. And it's just it's extremely interesting, and so I've always liked listening to that because it kind of transcended cycling and got into a very personal story, and you don't have the opportunity to do that very often.
Well, you mentioned that some of the reason that you got into podcasting yourself is because you actually listen to a lot of podcasts. So I'm interested to know who are some of your favorite cycling podcasters?
For whatever you think about it in terms of cycling, Lance Armstrong is a very good podcaster, and he's got a couple of podcasts. The Forward is pretty good, and it's not about cycling necessarily. I mean, probably one of the best sports interviews I've ever listened to, bar none, was when Lance Armstrong interviewed Bo Jackson on the Forward. A hugely entertaining interview. I mean, probably if you haven't listened to that, search for the Forward and find the episode with Bo Jackson. Probably the best sports interview I've ever heard. So I like listening to him. In the wintertime, I spend a lot of time on the stationary trainer. I use Trainer Road is the program that I use. They have a podcast. A lot of times, if I'm listening to a cycling podcast, it comes out every week, and I listen to it. And really, their goal of that podcast is to make people faster cyclists. So it's about power training, nutrition, health. It's all these things that go into to riding your bike better. So it's a very informative and entertaining too, but it's a very informative podcast. So those, from a cycling perspective, those are the 2 that I typically listen to.
Well, what advice would you give to someone who was interested in starting a podcast?
I would say that the most important thing is to just do it. You can get, for $100, a couple $100, even cheaper than that, you can have what you need to start a podcast. Just get a microphone, spend $80 on an Audio Technica ATR 2100 you can plug into your computer and start talking. And once you get, your episodes out there, I go back right now and listen to the first 4 or 5 episodes of my show. I'm like, I should take those down, but I'm like, no, it's part of the growth. And so you just gotta start. And then once you start doing it and you find out you like doing it and everything, then you can upgrade. You can learn a little more about it. One of the things that I do is I also help people who want to start podcasts. And again, having that audio engineering school background, I can help people figure out, what equipment they need and what they can do to kind of start their podcast and, and how to get it to the podcast host that you want to have it on and things like that. And so it's the best advice is just do it. Just find out what you want to talk about, sit down in front of a microphone. And even if you want to just start, talking to yourself, just do it and don't wait. And the other mistake people make was not really a mistake. It's just a misconception. They think, well, I'm going to record 10 episodes and then I'll put them out there. I'll just record an episode and get it out there. And a lot of times there's nothing more motivating than putting that first episode out there and going back and seeing that 10, 20, 30 people have listened to it. And you're like, oh, I'm going to do another episode. Success kind of fuels your growth too.
And I'd say there's some maybe some tie-ins to analogy for cycling as well, because you mentioned earlier, the more you do something, the better you get at it, right? So
it always still, and again, and this is a quote back from when my son played football. I used to always tell him, I said, you got to, because you got to get big and strong, play football. And I said, you got to remember, you can't just like go in the gym and kill yourself and then not go there for 2 or 3 days and think you're going to get stronger. I said, big changes happen in small increments over long periods of time. And so you have to keep at it, and you can't expect magic things to happen. It's going to happen, but it's going to happen in small increments over long periods of time. And sometimes people forget that.
Well, Barry, if it's okay with you, I'd like to share my screen and take a look at your website, and maybe you can talk to us about the different channels that people can access your content. Okay. Hey, look at this dude.
Hey, look, it's so cool, But this is really where, it's kind of becoming my destination site for everything, because I do a lot of different things. And And so if you go into podcast host,
Okay.
that's in there, you
Okay.
can see you have the podcast that I do. The primary ones that I do for myself, Louisville Cycling Podcast, and I Love Kentucky, and just so people know, I Love Kentucky is a show I put together. It's a show that celebrates all the people, the events, and the experiences that make Kentucky a great place to visit and live. And sometimes the state of Kentucky gets a little bit of a bad rap about being backwoods or whatever, but we actually have a lot of very innovative and fun and progressive things that go on in the state. And what I'm doing with this podcast is highlighting some of these things so that people can can enjoy some of the things that maybe they don't know about around our state. And you can, this is the page, and you can hear the most recent episodes I put up here. Getting ready to have an episode go up this weekend with a certain person that does the Kentucky Cycling Network. Scroll down, you can see I put if anybody wants to listen to it, there's Mayor Fisher's Bob's episode right there. And most people who ride bikes around the Louisville area knows Curtis Tolson. He's probably, at this point, he's probably old enough now I can call him the grandfather of cycling in Louisville. He wouldn't like that, but I'm going to do that because he wouldn't like that. But Curtis, he's a 2-time world champion and gosh, probably 43-time national champion on the track. I mean, a hell of a racer and always has been. So you can listen to episodes here. You can also, of course, go into any podcast, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher. You can tell your Amazon Echo device to play it. Pretty much anywhere you can access a podcast, you can find the Louisville Cycling Podcast.
Well, cool. Well, so talk to me a little about this logo. I'm noticing a microphone there.
Yeah, well, when I actually have a friend who her daughter is a graphic designer, and I had some general ideas about what I wanted in a logo, and I just threw them, and she drew this logo, and I kind of liked it because the microphone kind of is a nod toward the podcasting. The outline is supposed to look similar to a mountain bike tire, just so it doesn't look too roady. So I've got road handlebars, a mountain bike tire, a microphone. I like the colors, the red, blue. Those colors carry over to the I Love Kentucky podcast too. And so, I was kind of pleased with it, and I thought it was a good representation of what I'm trying to do.
Cool. And looking at the old side, I mean, you mentioned so many of these channels, but like the Apple Podcast, Google Play, you're on Spotify?
I'm on Spotify.
Okay.
Yeah, Spotify there.
And then Radio Public as well. And then, so talk to me. Do you have like a handle that gets used over and over again, like for Facebook and Twitter?
I do, and again, this is one of the places. This is my weak spot in this whole thing, is that's my personal site. There's no picture of our way back when we raced for Saturn. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see kind of some of the people we were talking about just a few minutes ago. I do have.
This is you right here, yeah.
Yeah, that's me. I do have Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn pages for all the podcasts, and over on the left side, the guy right in the middle, that's Bob Rowe.
Which one?
Right, one more right there. That's Bob. Okay. Brad Swope. A lot of people know Brad Swope. He's on the front there in that same column. Curtis is over on the front of this column over here. The kid that's right behind me in this picture, his name's Stuart Scoville. He and I rode together in 1996 and carried the Olympic torch from down off River Road all the way to Bedford, Kentucky during the centennial. And during that year, they decided they wanted to. The last time they had the Olympics, there were some issues, and they ran behind with all the runners with the torch relay.
Yeah.
So they wanted to get some cyclists involved to kind of help make up some time and do things. And so he and we carried the torch from Louisville to Bedford, Kentucky, a little over, gosh, I guess it was probably 50, 60 miles we rode, and got to be a part of the torch relay.
That's really cool. I'm noticing your T-shirt. So, do you have any kind of swag with your supporters if they're super enthusiastic and they want to pick up a T-shirt or do something like that?
I have stickers. I don't sell anything. I give people stickers, and if you go to bike shops, hopefully you can see one on the door. And I made some T-shirts up at one time. Again, I don't have advertisers. I haven't tried to monetize with advertisers or anything yet. When I started doing it, it was more for me just to kind of get back into the community more so than as a business venture.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, I don't have any T-shirts in stock now. I did buy, a few hundred T-shirts at one time and gave them out at races and things like that. So there's a few of them out there. We have a Louisville cycling, podcast, kind of informal. It's not really a team, but we have a full cycling kit that people can see. And I think when you're on my Facebook page, I think there's a picture of us in there wearing that. And so there's odds and ends, and occasionally I'll do things. And if there's a sponsor out there that wants to sponsor any T-shirts or cycling gear or anything like that, just give me a call. Well, I'm certainly willing to do it, but just don't have anything in stock right now.
But I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you'd like to share with the Kentucky cycling audience that I haven't already asked you about?
The big thing is go out and listen to a few episodes of the Louisville Cycling Podcast. And I know there's probably a lot of overlap in interest, but maybe not a lot of overlap in listenership right yet. And so I really encourage people to go out and give a listen to the Louisville Cycling Podcast. And most importantly, if you're doing something in cycling, or if you have a good story or know somebody with a good story, let me know, because I love to have people on and learn about what's going on. And you don't have to necessarily be in Louisville to be a part of that podcast. It's really about this Louisville cycling community and all the things that may be of interest to them. And so people in Louisville ride all over to go ride their bikes. And so if you're doing something that's cool, or even if it's not cycling related, if you're doing something that's cool that kind of highlights something that's uniquely Kentuckian, let me know, and you may be a good person to come on to the I Love Kentucky podcast. And so this as well as I do. One of the challenges we face is finding good content and putting together good content to put things out consistently. And so I always love to hear from people who listen, even if it's just to say, hey, I enjoyed that episode, or hey, you need to EQ your voice better on that episode. You didn't sound very good. Whatever it is, feedback is good.
Well, unless it's too much feedback, not the right kind of feedback, right? Not a buzz, in your sound.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Thanks again, Barry. I really appreciate you agreeing to be interviewed, and I hope people will go and check out the Louisville Cycling Podcast.
And when you do, make sure you go in and check it out this weekend. I don't know when you're going to post this, but this weekend is going to be around the 25th, 26th of April. And I'm actually have Nathan on the show talking about all the things that are going on with you and the Kentucky Cycling Network and all those kind of things. And so if nothing else, you got to go listen to at least one episode.
Well, thank you very, very much.
My stats to jump significantly this weekend.
Well, at least by one.
All right, Nathan, thank you a lot.
Thanks again to Barry Gary for being a guest in our Zoom interview series. If you enjoyed this content, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And be sure to stay tuned for more Zoom interviews over the next few weeks.